Mind is one of the leading mental health charities in the UK, and every year it brings out a report, a big mental health report. And so we had one in 2025 again. And some of the things that this report showed is that 1 in 5 adults struggle with mental health. That's a lot. Some of the things that this also showed is, so this is the age on, that's 1 in 5 for all ages. If you look at statistics for different ages, it shows that 16 to 29-year-olds struggle more than 1 in 4 with mental health issues. So you see, the younger the people get, the more they seem to struggle with that. And there's quite a development in that as well. 2025, we found, as I said, 25.8% of people between 16 and 24 here struggle with common mental health issues. 2027, it was only 17.5%. We see a drastic increase in mental health issues. Now, granted, part of that might be increasing awareness of that, but studies also just cite current climate. You know, there's wars and there's financial instabilities, there was COVID, there's just different things that play into that too. That this is not just because more people are aware of it, it seems to be an increasing problem. But let's be real for a second. You probably didn't need those stats, did you? Because each and every one of us, unless you have only 3 people in your sphere of influence, you know, family and friends, you have a child or a partner or a parent or a friend that deeply struggles. So for us as a church, it's quite an important topic to talk about, isn't it? And that's what we want to do. And as we dive in and look at some things these next 3 weeks, I want to say up front, in these talks, we are not fixing your mental health. You need to get professional help if you need it. Okay? I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, and neither are the other ones that are going to preach on that topic. There are great resources out there that can help you with your mental health. You can go to your GP, of course, who then can refer you further to people who can help you more specifically. You can go on nhs.uk, and there's a page for mental health services where you can call in a crisis, but also can try to find long-term care and help. And there's also this website, Mind is the one who did the mental health report. You can see mind.org.uk. There's also quite a lot of helpful resources. So we're not trying to fix your mental health. We have no qualifications to do that. But we wanted to talk about it anyway, because, you know, some of the things that your GP or, your expert that you might be seeing might struggle helping you with is asking the question, where is God in all of this? What's God's perspective on mental health, and where is He, and how, where can we see Him in all of that potentially? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to raise awareness, try to ask the question where God is. Because a matter of fact is, if you struggle with mental health, very often God might seem quite silent, and you might wonder where He is and why He doesn't show up more concretely in your life. And so we want to ask where He is in all of that. As we look at this story today, we're going to find a guy called Elijah today in 1 Kings 18 and 19, a book of the Old Testament. And I want to introduce you very quickly to Elijah. Elijah lived about 850 years before the turn of the century, before Christ came, and he lived in northern Israel. Elijah, I can only say this, he's like one of the biblical giants. He's the type of guy that church windows would, put him in occasionally, even 1,000 years later. That's the type of stuff that Chris only dreams about, isn't it? Being in a church window one day. It's like life goals right there, The New Testament talks about Elijah all the time as well. He's one of the most mentioned Old Testament characters in the New Testament. When John the Baptist came, the forerunner of Jesus, people said he is the Elijah, the one who prepares the way. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, the people around there were looking at Jesus and saying, let's see if he will call down Elijah from heaven. And Jesus had this very special moment in his life when some of his friends and him went up to a mountain, and he started, shining and glistening, and two characters came down from heaven, and one of them was Moses, who symbolizes the law in the Old Testament, and the other one was Elijah, who symbolizes all of the prophets. So Elijah, he is a big deal, like a really big deal. Doesn't get much bigger of a deal when it comes to biblical characters. And you won't believe what happened to Elijah in chapter 18 in 1 Kings. Elijah was facing 300 priests of Baal, priests that were worshiping another god that was worshipped commonly then called Baal or Baal. And they were having this kind of competition and standoff. They built two fireplaces, and they said, let's both the Baal's priests and Elijah on the other side call to our God, and whoever's fire is lit, there we know this God is real and that God is powerful. That's quite the task of faith, isn't it, for Elijah? To be honest, if I were in this situation, I would probably have found quite a good excuse. Something like, I don't need to prove that my God is real. He can prove himself, and I would have walked away and probably had my lunch at home all by myself. I wouldn't have followed through with that. That's a big task. That's a huge act of faith that Elijah is doing here. And we read in 1 Kings 18, Elijah stayed and he prayed and God provided the fire. So that's all just to kind of introduce Elijah to you so you kind of know who he is and you know what just happened. He really is like one of those biblical heroes. And we're going to read a text now following this heroic story that I just told you. And we're going to see what happens to one of those biblical heroes right after one of those heroic stories. And we read Elijah's story in 1 Kings 19. And we're going to see the hardships of a hero. So this is what happens next. Now Ahab, who's the king, told Jezebel, who was the queen, everything Elijah had done. And I'm just going to summarize the next couple verses for you briefly. Jezebel essentially said, Elijah, I will kill you. And so we find Elijah running. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba, that's in the south of Israel, in Judah, he left his servants there, and why he himself went on a day's journey into the wilderness. It would have been real nice, Elijah, that just did that huge act and victory of faith, if we would have seen him now, well and prosperous, finally coming, into a big position and settled well. But the reality is, after his great victory of faith, he is being persecuted. He has to run for his life. And then Elijah says the following in a second. So he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Elijah was thinking if he just had enough faith, he would be better and he would be able to save the whole nation of Israel. But he noticed that just his faith somehow didn't just help the whole situation, the whole country. And we have to listen into his words here carefully, because he prayed that he might die. He says, I've had enough, Lord, take my life. That's quite heavy and difficult, isn't it? I think that's a picture into his mental health. We don't want to overdiagnose from a distance. Like if a mental health expert would read this, he or she wouldn't be able to say, what exactly is wrong with Elijah. Professionals even can't overdiagnose from a distance, so we also don't want to overdiagnose. We don't know if this is heavy depression with suicidal ideation, if this is a complete burnout, if it's a personality disorder because he seems to sway from like moments of high to moments of low quite quickly to the extremes. We don't know if it's anxiety or if it's just a short episode of extreme sadness with existential questioning. We don't know, and we don't want to overdiagnose, but we know the hero of faith is not okay. He's not okay. He's really struggling. One of the most faithful and faith-filled prophets struggles deeply here. And if Elijah potentially struggles with his mental health, then we can say even the strongest people struggle. Elijah was so faithful, so full of faith. And I think what we're seeing here is that his great faith was not a granted fix for his mental health. Great faith is not a granted fix. That's quite important to you if you or somebody in your sphere of influence is struggling with mental health issues. Because that means if you're struggling with your mental health, that is not a sign of a lack of faith. If you're struggling with burnout or anxiety, it's not because you're not holy enough. If you're struggling with depression, it's not because you haven't done enough for God. That's what Elijah faced, one of those very faithful super prophets. And I think it's quite important that we all understand great faith is not a granted fix. I had a friend, I still have that friend, who started going to this church and having a new pastor, and she struggled with depression her whole life. And as she went up to her pastor and they started talking about it, the pastor told her, please stop taking medicine. Let's start praying and see that faith will heal you. Thankfully, she had enough backbone to disobey her pastor. That is one of the most toxic and difficult and dangerous things you can tell somebody who struggles with mental health. Faith will fix it. Because faith didn't fix it for the greatest faith heroes of the Old Testament, right? Like he struggled. So please don't say that to other people. And if you're recommended that, please don't listen to it. Find the help you need. Faith doesn't fix everything automatically. So that's the first thing I want you to hear because it's quite important. So we'll look and we still ask the question. So we see there is real faith heroes struggling, and we want to see how's God responding, what is God doing, and we see his gentle care. So we continue reading verse 5. Then he, that's Elijah, lay down under the bush and he fell asleep. And at once an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. And he looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. That sounds good, doesn't it? Freshly baked bread, man. And he ate and drank and then laid down again. And the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. I see in this story a God who doesn't turn his back to people who are struggling, but a God who gently draws near and who helps so concretely and practically. It's interesting, in Mind's research on mental health, one of the things that it found, especially in young people with mental health problems, is one of the reasons or one of the drivers is decline in sleep quality and sleep duration. So one of the things that's important is sleep. We also know one of the consequences of mental health struggles is oftentimes that people don't eat enough and eat regularly enough. And beautifully, God provides both the sleep. He just lets him sleep. And as he wakes him up gently. He provides some food. God just helps. He's just there gently caring for him. So I see that your struggle doesn't make God retreat. It makes him draw near gently. God's here, and he's here for you. And we're going to see how else God continues. So the question is, how can we experience God in some of those difficult crises? So he got up, so Elijah, after the tree, he had eaten and drank now, and strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into the cave and spent the night. Horeb, you might know it under a different name. It's the same mountain than Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is one of those important mountains in the Old Testament where God showed up in power repeatedly. Moses, one of the main characters and leaders of Israel that lived about 500 years before Elijah, he went up onto Mount Sinai and God showed up to him. He showed up in a burning bush before. He showed up and gave him the 10 Commandments. And the way God showed up to Moses was interesting too, because it says, and Mount Sinai, it was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. There's fire, there's winds, there's earthquakes. It's like God is in all of those for Moses, and there's quite a miraculous thing happening on that mountain. And now Elijah went on that mountain as well, and the word of the Lord came to him and asked, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It's an interesting question. The text doesn't quite specify if God sent Elijah to Horeb or if Elijah went out of his own volition. My guess is that Elijah went there. Because potentially he wanted to experience something just like Moses had experienced. We'll look at that in a second. Elijah's response is this. He says, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites, they have rejected your covenant, they have torn down your altars, and they have put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left. Literally, I alone am left. And now they are trying to kill me too." Elijah clearly struggles with all the weight that he has to carry in his life, doesn't he? And, he goes to a place where he knows God is found, where he knows miracles happened there and transformation happens as well. When Moses was on that mountain and he experienced the earthquake and the fire, he came down and it says his face was shining. People couldn't even look at him. He was transformed on that mountain. So maybe Elijah is searching for that kind of miraculous experience too, because he wants to be transformed by the power of God. That's so like me. That's so like what I would do when I struggle. I want to experience God in all of his glory and all of his powers. I think it's something that we all do. In our struggle, we tend to seek miraculous encounters with God. One of the special moments that happened to me in my faith once is, it's about 15 years ago. I was in one of those mega churches in America with like 10,000 people in there, and I sat all the way up on the balcony, and we celebrated communion, and they passed the bread and the wine through the rows and had some beautiful music playing in the background, and I just remember that moment. I don't think ever felt God that densely and concretely in my life. I sat there with Kristen, who was then my new girlfriend, and with her parents on the other side, and I was just weeping, because somehow there was this crazy, unexplainable, dense encounter with God. It's hard to explain it. And it was beautiful, and it sustained me in senses. The interesting thing is, after I had that experience doing communion with God, what do you think I wanted during my next communion? God, give me that again, right? I want to experience you like this every time I take communion now. And that felt so beautiful and nice. And the next time I took communion and somehow nothing happens. It was just kind of silent and quiet. And I didn't cry and I wanted to cry and I tried. And it's like somehow, no, it didn't work. And so for 15 years, I've been looking for that encounter again. God, show up in power again like you did back then, please. I need another kick. I need another dopamine hit. God, it was so nice to show, especially when I'm going through difficult times. That's what I long for, a miraculous encounter with God. That's what we do, don't we? I think that's what Elijah longed for, and I think that's why he went on to that specific mountain, because that's a mountain where that oftentimes is found. And the Lord said to him, go out and stand on the mountains in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. It sounds like God's really doing it, right? He's doing it like he did it to Moses. He's passing by and it's going to be power, and wait for this. And then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. Oh my gosh, praise him. Great and powerful wind, right? That's what he's looking for. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, just like with Moses. Oh my goodness, he's here, right? He's showing up in power. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, just like with Moses. There's the Lord, right? Surely that must be him. But the Lord was not in the fire. Isn't that interesting? Like Elijah potentially just looking for that other miracle, that next encounter, that next dopamine hit potentially, and all of those things happen, and God is not in any of them. It's almost like God doesn't play the dopamine game. So where is God then? And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. So this shows us that in that God is being found. The phrase that's used here is a Hebrew phrase. The Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. That's quite fascinating. The three words that are used here are kol, dak, and demama, which means a sound of thin silence. So it's oftentimes in the older translations translated with a gentle whisper, but the newer translations translated something like this, a sound of sheer silence. And I think that's a better translation. One of the most respected Old Testament theologians, Walter Brueggemann, who still lives, he says, more recent opinion suggests no voice, no sound, but an eerie silence laden with a sense of holiness. And I love that. That speaks to me deeply. So how does God show up? No voice, no sound, but an eerie sense of holiness. I think we have forgotten how to be silent in our world, haven't we? When I want to learn about silence, I oftentimes have to go back like 1,000 years to some, Christian writers that wrote about silence. And this young, beautiful man, Meister Eckhart, is a German theologian who lived in 1200s. He wrote a whole sermon on silence, and I love what he says because it resonates so deeply with me. So he would say, and I'm putting words into his mouth first, but then I'll bring a quote to kind of prove that. He would say, oftentimes we use silence for striving. Okay, so we are silent in order to reach something in our lives. We are striving in and through silence to be someone, to be important, to potentially be a great messenger. So when we are silent, we use the silent, we misuse the silence, because we say, well, I'm silent so I can think about deep things. It's an intellectual exercise. Or we want to be silent in order to get a big revelation, a word or a picture. Neither of them, Meister Eckhart would say, is silence. And all of them can lead to self-exaltation, because ultimately then it's about what I hear and what I think about. And Meister Eckhart would say, in the purest sense of silence, God works without means and without pictures. Silence is just being. It's God infusing his presence, and we don't need to feel him, hear him, see him, think deeply about him. We can just be. And so in silence, Meister Eckhart would say, there's a mystical union with God. And I think that's exactly what that text is teaching. Silence is the juxtaposition to seeking the miraculous word and work of God. It's just being, and it's just trusting that God is there in the silence. And you know what? I think that's good news. I think that's good news, especially when you're struggling. Because oftentimes, and we have learned this in church and culture, we talk about, well, here's your ways to encounter God, and here's what you must do, and here's how he will show up. And then we struggle with mental health or just a deep crisis, and we can't feel God, and we can't hear God, and we can think deeply about God, and we might feel like, well, God must not be there then. And the reality is, God is in the silence. He's there when you can't hear nothing. He's there when you can't feel nothing. He's there when you can't see God. He's there when you can't think about him. God is there. The band can come back up as we draw to a close. God is in the silence. I hope you let that be an encouragement to you as you experience silence in your life, as you experience God not speaking, or you're not being able to do all of those intellectual exercises. God is in the silence in this story. I want to give you one more point here as we continue. Life in the imperfection. So then a voice said to him, so we have a new paragraph that's happening here. A voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And the interesting thing is, he replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord Almighty, blah, blah, blah. Elijah says this exact same thing again. You know, that encounter with God that he had in the silence didn't change him at all. He still has the same problems he had before. And that's oftentimes how it happens for us, right? Our problems don't just go away. And this is what God does. The Lord said to him, go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. And when you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram, and he gives him a stack of tasks to do. You know, I find this so fascinating because God isn't saying you need to be completely fixed first until I can use you. God is saying, you are struggling, and now go and do. I have a very close friend of mine who went to my church in Herzog, and she's one of the most qualified psychiatrists with her own clinic, and she told me dozens of stories of people coming into her office, and she said the thing about mental health is sometimes you just need to stop everything and you need to try to get better. Most of the times, people who are struggling with mental health, with personality disorders, whatever it might be, they might struggle for all of their life. They might get a little better, but they will never get well. And she says the thing is, most people will say, well, I have to get well first, and then I can live my life. And then I can continue, and then I can be used by God. And she says the reality is, for most people struggling with mental health issues, it's more like learning to ride a dragon. The dragon being the mental health issue, right? And still being able to work and function and be a blessing to other people and be used by God. And that's what God's doing with Elijah, right? He didn't wait until he was fixed and perfect, until he was fit for purpose. He used him even while he was struggling. And that's maybe a message that you might need to hear as well. God can and will use you, even when you're struggling. Maybe He'll actually use your struggle for good to be able to help other people as well. So sometimes it's learning to ride the dragon. You don't need to be fixed to be fit for purpose. I love the picture of God that this text is giving us. It's a picture of God that frees from pressure, that's so gentle, and that's so freeing. And maybe in this moment, you want to spend time with God who's here in the silence. Even if you can't see Him or hear Him or feel Him, you can live in the certainty that He is here with you. Let me pray. Jesus, thank you that you are present and that you are so gentle and that you love us so deeply. In your name, Jesus.